On a cold morning in the spring of 1812, a man stood at a map table in a palace in Paris and decided the fate of 600,000 lives. He was 42 years old. His hair had begun to thin. He had grown heavier in recent years, the sharp, wolfish face of the young general softening into something closer to a Roman bust. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, and on that morning, if you had asked anyone in Europe who the most powerful man alive was, there would have been only one answer. Imagine what it felt like to be him. You are Emperor of the French. You rule directly over 130 departments and 44 million citizens. Through brothers, brothers-in-law, marshals and puppet kings, you command the obedience of another 46 million souls. Your flag flies from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the shores of the Adriatic. Your brother Joseph sits on the throne of Madrid. Your stepson rules northern Italy. Your brother Louis, until recently, ruled Holland. You have married the daughter of the Austrian emperor, the same emperor whose armies you shattered at Austerlitz 7 years earlier. Prussia is bent, Austria is tame, and your only truly dangerous enemies, the British, pace on their small, rainy island, unable to touch you across the water. You are, by any reasonable measure, the master of the known world. And yet, on that morning in Paris, in the quiet between one campaign and the next, a small question should have been whispering in the back of the emperor's mind. A question that had nothing to do with maps or cannon or marching columns. The question was this: when you conquer a king, have you truly conquered a country? Napoleon never asked that question, not seriously, not once. And because he did not ask it, within 3 years of that morning, he would be a prisoner on a rock in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, 10 miles by 5 miles of volcanic cliffs, watched by 3,000 British soldiers, living in a damp house riddled with mould, carving peepholes in his own shutters so he could look out without being seen. He would die there on the 5th of May, 1821, at the age of 51. A stomach slowly devoured from the inside by cancer. His tomb would bear no name, because the British governor of the island, a cold man called Hudson Lowe, would not permit the word Napoleon to be carved into the stone. How does a man fall from the heights of Europe to a nameless grave on a wind-swept island? The history books will tell you the obvious answer: the armies of Russia, the red coats of the British, the long, slow wearing down of a continent that finally rose against him. The winter, the ice, the hunger, the generals who betrayed him at the end. All of it is true, all of it matters, but tonight we are going to look somewhere else. Tonight, we are going to open a smaller, quieter file. The file of the things he did not see. Because here is the strange truth about Napoleon Bonaparte. He was, by most reckonings, the greatest military mind since Julius Caesar. He could read a battlefield the way a violinist reads a score. He could move 100,000 men across a continent and deliver them to a precise spot on a precise day. He rewrote European law in a code that still governs much of the continent 2 centuries later. He spoke rapidly, thought rapidly, calculated rapidly. Aides described him dictating letters to 3 secretaries at once on 3 different subjects. And still he had a blind spot, a shadow in his vision that by the year 1812 had already begun to eat at the foundations of his empire in 3 separate corners of Europe. He could not see it. He had never been able to see it. And the shape of that blind spot is the story we are telling tonight. Let us set the scene properly. The map of Europe in the spring of 1812 looked like nothing the continent had ever seen. Paint it, and most of it would be French. France itself had swollen far beyond its ancient borders, absorbing Belgium, the Rhineland, the Dutch coast, the northern Italian plain, the Dalmatian shore. Around this bloated core lay the client kingdoms and satellite states: Westphalia, Naples, the Kingdom of Italy, the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, the Confederation of the Rhine, a loose collection of German principalities held together by French bayonets and French gold. Farther out, the forced allies. Austria, humiliated after a string of defeats, now bound by marriage. Prussia, reduced to a rump state, its army shrunken by treaty. Denmark, loyal out of fear of the British Navy. And then, at the far eastern edge, a Russia that was technically an ally, but increasingly restless, increasingly resentful, increasingly ready to slip the leash. Only two powers still stood outside the system entirely. Portugal, a small kingdom on the far western shore of the Iberian Peninsula, clinging to its ancient alliance with Britain. And Britain itself, separated from the continent by 22 miles of grey water that might as well have been 1,000. If you had told any king or statesman of 1802, 10 years earlier, that a Corsican artillery officer would one day rule all of this, they would have laughed you out of the room. And yet, here he was, the little man with the famously bad handwriting, the husband of an Austrian princess, the father of an infant son they called the King of Rome. Now, picture him in that palace. Picture the war room, the tall windows, the long table covered in maps, marshals in their blue coats, their chests heavy with medals and stars, secretaries with pen and ink, and the emperor himself moving small wooden markers across the continent like a man playing chess with pieces the size of armies. From above, on that map, everything looked solved. The British had been sealed off behind an economic blockade that stretched from the Baltic to the Strait of Gibraltar. The Spanish royal family, that ridiculous pair of squabbling Bourbons, had been swept aside, and his own brother now wore the crown in Madrid. Russia was wavering, but Russia could be taught a lesson. A quick campaign. 30 days, Napoleon told his ministers. 30 days, and the Tsar would sign. Everything looked solved. Everything was under control. And yet, beneath that map, in places the emperor did not bother to look, something had already gone wrong. In the dusty hills of Castile, a priest in a village called Carabanchel Alto had, 4 years earlier, murdered a French captain in a back alley. A small crime, hardly worth reporting. And yet, around that killing, a kind of invisible fire had begun to spread. In the mountains of Navarre, shepherds were learning to use muskets. In the convents of Aragon, friars were hiding couriers and storing powder. Along every road between Madrid and the French border, French soldiers were beginning to disappear in ones and twos, and their bodies, when found, were found with their throats cut. In the cold harbours of the north, from Hamburg to Riga, merchants were discovering that British cotton still found its way into their warehouses labelled as American or Swedish, or, when the forgery grew lazy, not labelled at all. Coastal officials were being bribed in quiet parlours. Fishing boats were crossing the channel under the cover of fog, their holds packed with coffee and sugar and English tools. And in the courts of St. Petersburg, a young Tsar named Alexander, who had embraced Napoleon on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River only 5 years earlier, was reading reports of Russian merchants ruined by the French blockade. He was listening to nobles who had lost fortunes. He was beginning, very quietly, to consider the unthinkable. None of this appeared on the map in Paris. None of this fit into the calculations of the emperor. None of these people, these nobodies with their knives and their ledgers and their whispered resentments, existed in the world Napoleon had built. They were beneath the map. They were beneath notice. And that, as we will see tonight, was the single most expensive mistake of his life. Because the world does not run only on armies and treaties and the movements of kings. It runs on something the emperor could not quite bring himself to take seriously: the hearts of ordinary people, the stubbornness of a shepherd who has buried his son, the quiet fury of a merchant who has watched his warehouse burn, the strange, stupid, glorious loyalty of villagers to a flag they have never even seen. Napoleon Bonaparte commanded the largest empire Western Europe had known since the Caesars. He had everything a man could have, everything except the one thing he refused to see. It began, as many wars do, with a favour. In the autumn of 1807, 2 armies marched along the dusty roads of northern Spain, and to a Spanish peasant watching from a hilltop, they looked like friends. The soldiers wore different uniforms, the French in their dark blue coats, the Spanish in white, but they were travelling west together toward the Portuguese border on a joint mission. Portugal, the small kingdom on the Atlantic, had refused to cut its trade with the British. The French emperor had demanded that the Spanish king allow his troops to pass through Spanish territory to punish the Portuguese for their insolence. The Spanish king, a dim and broken man named Charles IV, had agreed. A treaty had been signed at Fontainebleau. French troops would cross Spain. Portugal would be subdued, and then, presumably, the French would go home. By the 30th of November, 1807, a French general named Junot stood in the streets of Lisbon. The Portuguese royal family had already fled to Brazil, taking the treasury with them on British ships. The campaign had been almost bloodless. From Paris, it looked like another easy victory. But the French troops did not go home. By February of 1808, 70,000 more French soldiers were streaming over the Pyrenees. They occupied the fortresses of Pamplona and Barcelona, in some cases by trickery. One convoy of supposedly wounded men asked for shelter inside a Spanish citadel, then threw back the blankets on their stretchers and produced loaded muskets. The Spanish governors, confused and unprepared, watched as their own country filled up with soldiers who were supposed to be their allies. And in the spring, Napoleon played his hand. He summoned the Spanish royal family to the small French border town of Bayonne. He sent charming letters. He promised to mediate a dispute between old Charles and his ambitious son Ferdinand, who had just forced his father to abdicate in a palace coup known as the Mutiny of Aranjuez. Both men trusted him. Both men came, and at Bayonne, between the 5th and 7th of May 1808, Napoleon did something that no emperor in Europe had done for a very long time. He simply took the crown. He forced Ferdinand to return his rights to his father. He forced Charles to hand those rights to him. And then, on the 4th of June, he issued a decree appointing his own elder brother, Joseph Bonaparte, as King of Spain. Joseph was a decent man, a lawyer by training. He had been ruling the Kingdom of Naples for 2 years, and by all accounts doing it reasonably well. He did not want the Spanish throne. When the letter arrived telling him he was now King of Spain, he reportedly sat in silence for a long time. His brother was not asking. His brother never asked. From Paris, the whole thing looked brilliantly clean. The old dynasty was gone. A new, enlightened king was on his way. The Spanish Enlightenment, the small class of educated liberals known as the afrancesados, the French lovers, would embrace him. Feudal privileges would fall, the Inquisition would be abolished, reform would sweep through a dusty, backward kingdom. Everything had been calculated, everything except the one thing that could not be calculated: the people. News of the Bayonne abdications reached Madrid on the 1st of May, 1808. On the 2nd of May, the city erupted. Picture the scene. It is a warm morning. The smell of bread and horse dung hangs in the narrow streets. In front of the royal palace, a small crowd has gathered because word has spread that the last members of the royal family are being taken away to France. A child is crying. A woman is shouting that they are stealing the king's son. And around the corner, a detachment of French cavalry appears, Marshal Joachim Murat's elite imperial guard, including a squadron of the Mamluks, the Egyptian horseman Napoleon had brought back from his campaign in the Near East. The Mamluks wore turbans. They rode into the crowd with curved scimitars drawn. And to the citizens of Madrid, watching men in turbans hacking down Spaniards in front of a Catholic palace, something ancient stirred. This was not just a foreign army. This was the return of the Moors. This was the reopening of a wound that Spain had been nursing for 700 years. The uprising spread through the city within hours. Men climbed to rooftops with pistols. Women poured boiling water from balconies. A navvy used a pair of scissors to stab a French dragoon off his horse. By afternoon, the city was a battlefield, and by evening, the French had put it down with grapeshot and bayonets. The next day, the 3rd of May, the French lined up hundreds of prisoners against a hill outside the city and shot them in batches. A Spanish painter named Francisco Goya would, years later, record that moment in a painting that still hangs in the Prado. A man in a white shirt, arms flung wide, facing a firing squad in the dark. His face is not noble, it is terrified. And somehow that terror would come to stand for everything the emperor had failed to understand. Because what Napoleon did not see in the calm of his palace in Paris was this: every shot fired into that hillside did not kill a rebellion, it planted one. Within weeks, the whole country was in flames. It was not a coordinated rebellion. The Spanish had no government left, no army worth the name, no central command. What they had was something older and more dangerous. They had fury and they had geography. The word the Spanish used for the new kind of war was guerrilla. It simply meant little war. It would enter every language in the world. In the mountains of Navarre, a farmer's son named Esposimina raised a band of a few hundred men and began cutting French throats on the roads between the passes. In the hills of Aragon, a monk named El Empecinado, the stubborn one, led raids by moonlight. In Catalonia, the villagers of one valley would hide a wounded French courier in a barn, feed him, nurse him, and then, when he was strong enough to travel, walk him out to a quiet bend in the road and cut him down. The French, who had the best regular army in the world, did not know how to fight this. Their marshals, Soult, Ney, Massena, Suchet, men who had broken kings in a morning, now found themselves sending patrols of 50 men out into the countryside and receiving back the heads of 12 and the horses of 3. Joseph Bonaparte, the new king, entered Madrid on the 20th of July, 1808. He stayed 11 days. On the 19th of that same month, a Spanish army under General Castaños surrounded and defeated a French force under General Dupont at a place called Belen in the sun-bleached hills of Andalusia. Nearly 20,000 French soldiers surrendered. It was the first time a French imperial army had been defeated on land since the Revolution. All of Europe sat up and looked. Joseph fled his own capital. He did not return until December, and then only because Napoleon himself had come south with 200,000 men to put the country back in order. And here is where the disaster began to reveal its shape.
The emperor, famously, spent less than 3 months personally in Spain. He believed the problem was solved. He returned to Paris to deal with other matters. He left his marshals in charge, and those marshals, brave and brilliant as they were, discovered that they had been handed a war that no amount of brilliance could win. Because the Spanish ulcer, as Napoleon himself would come to call it, worked like this. For every battle the French won, they were victorious on the day. Ciudad Rodrigo was taken, Badajoz was stormed. Wellington, the red-coated British general who had landed in Portugal in August of 1808, was pushed back time after time to his defensive lines. And yet the bleeding never stopped. At the peak of the war, the French had more than 350,000 soldiers in Spain. Over 200,000 of them were not fighting anyone. They were guarding roads. They were escorting grain wagons. They were sitting in blockhouses along supply lines, waiting for the shepherds in the hills to come for them in the dark. Every letter sent from Madrid to Paris had to be carried by a squadron of cavalry because a single courier was a dead courier. By the time the war ended in 1814, historians estimate that nearly 250,000 French soldiers had died in Spain. The Iberian Peninsula itself had lost perhaps 1 million dead, a figure that, even today, is hard to fully grasp. The emperor had imagined he was fighting a kingdom. He was, in truth, fighting a country. And a country is not the same thing as its king. A country is a shepherd with a grudge. A country is a monk with a knife. A country is a woman on a balcony with a pot of boiling water, waiting for the next column of foreign soldiers to pass below her window. Napoleon had written in his endless correspondence thousands of words about the Spanish campaign. He had designed strategies, he had issued orders, he had appointed viceroys and military governors. In all those millions of words, he had failed to reckon with one small, terrible fact. The Spanish did not want to be enlightened. They wanted their land back, and they would take it back, one French soldier at a time, for 6 years, until the wound he had opened in 1808 bled his empire white. There is a kind of power that cannot be seen. It moves in the holds of ships, in the ledgers of merchants, in the quiet arithmetic of salt and sugar and iron. It leaves no bodies on the field. It produces no statues. It fights its wars not with cannon, but with the slow, patient pressure of need against rule. Napoleon Bonaparte understood many things. This was not one of them. On the 21st of November, 1806, the emperor stood in a palace in Berlin, the captured capital of a broken Prussian kingdom, and signed a decree. The ink had not yet dried on the victory at Jena. The Prussian king was in flight. The old Continental order was in pieces at his feet. And from the desk of his conquered enemy, Napoleon issued what he believed would be the final blow against the last power in Europe that still defied him. The British Isles, the decree announced, were under blockade. From that day forward, no ship from Britain, no cargo from a British colony, no letter bearing a British stamp would be permitted to enter any port in any territory under French influence. Every British subject found on continental soil would be treated as a prisoner of war. Every British good would be seized and burned. The economic lifeblood of the island empire would be stopped at the water's edge. They called it the Continental system. In the minds of its architects, it was the answer to a problem that had tormented Napoleon for 5 years. The problem was simple. Britain was unreachable. At Trafalgar, 1 year earlier, a one-armed, one-eyed British admiral named Horatio Nelson had shattered the combined fleets of France and Spain off the coast of Cadiz. Nelson had died on the deck of his flagship that afternoon, but his victory had ended, once and for all, any French dream of crossing the Channel. Napoleon's Grand Army could march from Madrid to Moscow if he wished. It could not sail 22 miles of grey water, so if the British could not be invaded, they would be starved. They were, after all, a nation of shopkeepers. Napoleon was fond of the phrase, a nation that lived on trade. A nation whose factories depended on continental markets, whose merchants depended on continental customers, whose treasury depended on customs duties flowing through the docks of London and Liverpool, closed those markets, shut those doors, watched the island wither. It was a beautiful theory. On paper, in the calm rooms of the Tuileries, it looked airtight. The British government, when news of the decree reached London, simply laughed. One minister was reported to have said that Napoleon might as well have talked of blockading the moon and possessing himself of all the lunar influence as talked of blockading Great Britain. The Royal Navy had over 600 warships at sea. The French had scarcely 50. To enforce a blockade, you needed ships. Napoleon had an army. The decree went out anyway. One by one, the nations of Europe were forced to sign on. Prussia, already defeated, had no choice. Holland, under his brother Louis, complied. The Confederation of the Rhine fell into line. At Tilsit, on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River, in July of 1807, a young Russian Tsar named Alexander embraced Napoleon and agreed to close his ports to the British. Denmark was dragged in. Austria joined in 1809 after another defeat. Sweden, Italy, Capels, the Kingdom of Westphalia, the whole continent, from the Baltic ice to the heel of the Italian boot, was now a closed market. On the map, it looked airtight. In the real world, it leaked like a sieve. Consider what Napoleon had actually built. He had drawn a circle around a continent with thousands of miles of coastline, countless harbours, countless river mouths, countless small fishing villages whose men had been smuggling goods past customs officers since the age of sail began. And he had asked these men, essentially, to cooperate in their own impoverishment. A linen weaver in Westphalia, who had been selling to British merchants for 3 generations, was now told that his market no longer existed. A Russian timber exporter, who had been shipping masts to Portsmouth for decades, was told to find other customers. A coffee merchant in Hamburg, who sold to a city that drank coffee the way it drank air, was told that coffee, a colonial product, much of it coming through British trade, was now contraband. And the French farmer in the wine country of Bordeaux, who had for centuries shipped his casks across the Channel, discovered that the market for his wine had simply disappeared, his storehouses filled. His prices collapsed. The port of Bordeaux, once one of the busiest in Europe, grew quieter each year. Napoleon had imagined that the weapon would point at London. It pointed slowly at first, and then with gathering force at the cities and farms of the empire itself. The leaks began almost at once. The coastlines of northern Germany became the first great hole in the wall. The island of Heligoland, a tiny rock in the North Sea, was seized by the British in 1807 and turned into a gigantic warehouse, a floating market stacked with British cotton, sugar, coffee, machinery, and gunpowder from which smugglers sailed in every direction. Within months of the Berlin Decree, by some estimates, nearly 1,500 ships had slipped into Hamburg alone, their holds heavy with British goods. In the Mediterranean, the pattern was the same. Sicily, which remained stubbornly pro-British, became a conduit for goods flowing into Italy. The Ionian city of Salonika moved British cotton into the Balkans. Malta, in British hands since 1800, became a floating department store for the entire southern trade. And Gibraltar, that stubborn rock at the mouth of the Mediterranean, which the Spanish had failed to take from the British for 100 years, became the great beating heart of contraband flowing into Iberia. The French tried. They truly tried. Customs officers patrolled the coasts. Burnings were ordered. In one particularly theatrical moment, a great bonfire was made in Frankfurt of confiscated British goods, and the smoke could be seen for miles. But there were not enough officers, and there was too much coast, and the men who were supposed to enforce the system were themselves being bribed in quiet parlours with the same British gold they were meant to refuse. Even the emperor's own family undermined him. His brother Louis, ruling Holland, found it impossible to enforce the blockade on the Dutch coast without destroying the Dutch economy entirely. Louis quietly looked the other way. He was eventually forced to abdicate for his trouble. Napoleon's puppets in Spain, in Westphalia, in the small German states, all found similar accommodations with the smugglers. The system was enforced loudly from above and ignored quietly from below. And then, in 1810, something happened that revealed just how badly the weapon had turned in Napoleon's hand. The British economy did suffer. That much is true. Unemployment rose. There were riots in the textile towns. The Luddite movement smashed its first machines, but British exports to the rest of the world, to the Americas, to India, to the new markets being opened in Asia, rose sharply. Trade that had once flowed to Hamburg now flowed to Buenos Aires. Trade that had once gone to Bordeaux now went to Boston. The British merchant fleet did not collapse, it adapted. Meanwhile, the economies of France's own allies were being strangled. Russian nobles, whose estates produced timber and grain for the British market, watched their incomes shrink year after year. By 1810, the Tsar could no longer sustain it. In December of that year, he issued a decree opening Russian ports to neutral shipping, which everyone understood to mean British shipping disguised under American and Scandinavian flags. It was the beginning of the end of the Franco-Russian alliance, and in 1811, Napoleon himself did something that amounted to an unspoken confession. He issued the St. Cloud Decree, which quietly opened the southwest of France and the Spanish frontier to British trade, under licenses, under taxes, under various fig leaves, but opened nonetheless. The blockade, it turned out, was hurting France more than it was hurting Britain. What the emperor had built was not a wall. It was a dam in a river, and rivers, given enough time, always find their way around. He had mistaken economic life for something that could be commanded, but economic life is not an army. You cannot order a sack of coffee to stop moving. You cannot court-martial a sugar loaf for desertion. The sailor who slipped into a Dutch harbour at midnight with a hold full of British cotton was not a traitor to France. He was a father trying to feed his children. The merchant who bribed the customs officer was not an enemy of the empire. He was a businessman keeping his business alive. Multiply those small, private decisions by 10 million, and you have the invisible tide that broke the continental system. And here is the part that cut deepest. In trying to strangle Britain, Napoleon made enemies of the very nations whose cooperation he needed most. The Russian nobility turned against him, the Dutch turned against him, the Hanseatic merchants turned against him. The Spanish, who had their own reasons already, added economic grievance to national grievance. Each ally he forced into the system became, over time, an ally looking for an excuse to leave it. A man who fights with armies can see his battlefield. A man who fights with blockades is fighting with ghosts. And the emperor, for all his genius, could not see ghosts. On the 24th of June, 1812, an army crossed a river, and for 6 weeks afterward, the most dangerous man in Europe could not find his enemy. The river was the Neman, a slow brown waterway that marked the border between the Duchy of Warsaw and the Russian Empire. The army was the Grande Armée, a force so vast that no one who saw it ever forgot the sight. Over 600,000 men, drawn from every corner of Napoleon's continent. Frenchmen, yes, but also Poles and Lithuanians, Bavarians and Saxons, Prussians dragged in against their will, Austrians fulfilling the grudging obligations of a recent alliance, Italians and Dutchmen and Swiss, a few thousand even from distant Spain and Portugal, 12 corps, 200,000 horses. 1,372 guns, a supply train of nearly 8,000 wagons stretching back into Prussia like the tail of some immense beast. One Prussian officer who watched the crossing wrote that he could not see where the columns began or where they ended. They were simply a dark river of men flowing eastward under a summer sun. Napoleon rode at the head of them. He had told his ministers the campaign would take 30 days. He had said it in Paris, and he had said it in Dresden, and he had said it again to his marshals on the banks of the Neman. The Tsar would see this host, would understand that further resistance was madness, and would come to terms. A quick, clean demonstration of force, a signed treaty, back to Paris by autumn. That was the plan. It was the plan of a man who had never understood Russia, because Russia did not come to meet him. For the first weeks, the Grande Armée marched through empty country. Villages stood silent as they approached. Chickens had been killed, granaries had been burned, wells had been fouled. The Russian armies, under a careful Baltic German general named Barclay de Tolly, fell back and back and back, refusing battle, drawing the emperor deeper into a country that, day by day, had less to offer him. This was not the style of war Napoleon had built his career on. His method had always been the same: move fast, find the enemy, force him into a decisive battle, crush him in a single afternoon, dictate terms before the smoke cleared. It had worked at Austerlitz, at Jena, at Friedland, at Wagram. It was the rhythm of his genius, and Russia was refusing to dance to it. By the time the French reached Vilna, a week into the campaign, the summer heat was already doing what the Russian army would not. Men collapsed on the roads, horses dropped in their traces. The great supply train, so carefully assembled over 2 years, began to fall apart almost at once. Wagons broke on the rough Russian tracks, oxen died, drivers deserted, and all the while the Russian armies kept retreating, leaving behind them a landscape of ashes. The French called it the strategy of the scorched earth, though the Russians did not yet have a name for it. They simply did it. When Cossacks rode through a village before the French arrived, they rode out again, carrying everything that could be carried and burning everything that could not. Barns went up, haystacks went up, the standing grain in the fields, a month from harvest, was trampled or torched. In the city of Smolensk, in August, the retreating Russians set fire to their own city rather than leave it intact for the invaders. Napoleon's men entered a smoking ruin. By the time the army reached the outskirts of Moscow, in the first week of September, Napoleon had already lost over half his men, not to battle, to dysentery, to typhus, to heat, to hunger, to simple exhaustion in a country that refused to feed them. Of the 450,000 men who had crossed the Neman in June, perhaps 130,000 were still fit to stand in line. It was then, on a low ridge west of a small village called Borodino, that the Russians finally turned to fight. A new commander had taken charge of the Russian armies. His name was Mikhail Kutuzov. He was 67 years old, stout, one-eyed, famously fond of food and sleep, and to the young officers of his staff, he often seemed half-dozing at critical moments. He had lost to Napoleon before, at Austerlitz in 1805, and he had learned something that day that Barclay had also learned, but had been unable to sell to the Russian court. You did not beat Napoleon by outmaneuvering him, you beat him by outlasting him. On the 7th of September 1812, the two armies collided at Borodino in the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic age. 250,000 men fought across a few square miles of open ground, around earthworks with names that would become famous in Russian memory: the Great Redoubt, the Bagration Flèches. By evening, when the guns finally stopped, 70,000 men lay dead or wounded in the fields, 30,000 French, 45,000 Russians. Prince Bagration, commanding the Russian left, took a splinter in the thigh and would die of the wound 17 days later. The French held the ground. By the old rules of war, this meant Napoleon had won. By the new rules, the rules Russia was teaching him, he had done nothing at all. Because when the French looked across the field the next morning, the Russian army was gone. Kutuzov had done the unthinkable. He had chosen, after the bloodiest battle of his life, to retreat again. He had called a council of war at a small village called Fili, on the outskirts of Moscow, and he had said the words that his generals could not bear to hear. The loss of Moscow is not the loss of Russia, but the loss of the army is. And so, on the 14th of September, 1812, Napoleon rode into Moscow through silent streets. He had expected a delegation. The the keys to the city, a mayor on his knees, envoys from the Tsar suing for peace. This was the rhythm that had followed every capital he had ever entered. Vienna had surrendered, Berlin had surrendered, Madrid had surrendered, Moscow would surrender. Moscow did not surrender. Moscow was empty. Of the 270,000 people who had lived there at the start of 1812, perhaps 10,000 remained, mostly the poor, the sick, the foreign tutors who had missed the last carriages out. The great mansions stood with their doors unlocked. Clocks still ticked on mantelpieces. Food still sat in kitchens. But the city itself, the living thing, had evacuated. It had simply walked away from him. Napoleon took up residence in the Kremlin. He wrote to the Tsar proposing peace. He waited for a reply. That night, around 2 o'clock in the morning, the fires began. They started in the trading stalls near the Kremlin wall, then in Petrovka Street, then in the warehouses by the river. Within hours, half a dozen neighborhoods were burning, and by dawn the wind had carried the flames into the wooden heart of the old city. Moscow had been built mostly of wood. The fire brigade had been stripped of its equipment on the orders of the city's governor, a man named Fyodor Rostopchin, before he had left. Soldiers captured with torches in their hands admitted, under questioning, that they had been ordered to burn the city. The fires burned for 4 days. When they finally died down on the 18th of September, 3/4 of Moscow was gone. The glow of the burning capital could be seen, it was said, from 130 miles away. Napoleon wrote a second letter to Alexander. Beautiful, magical Moscow exists no more. He received no reply. The Tsar, far away in St. Petersburg, wrote privately that the burning of Moscow had illuminated his soul. He meant it as a vow. He would not negotiate. For 35 days, the emperor sat in the half-ruined Kremlin and waited. His army ate through what food remained. His horses ate the straw of the mattresses, and when the straw was gone, they ate the thatch of the roofs, and when the thatch was gone, they began to die. Discipline collapsed. The soldiers looted, priests' vestments were stripped of their gold, officers drank themselves unconscious in the wine cellars of princes who had fled, and all the while the days were growing shorter. The air, which had been warm when they arrived, began to carry a new edge in the mornings. On the 19th of October, Napoleon gave the order at last. The army would leave Moscow. The army would march south, through country that had not yet been burned, and find winter quarters in a warmer province. The Russians were waiting for him. At a small town called Maloyaroslavets, 5 days later, Kutuzov blocked the southern road. There was a short, savage fight. Napoleon won the ground, but could not afford another battle like it. He turned his army around. He chose the only other route available, the road by which they had come. The road lined now with the burned villages and the emptied fields and the unburied bodies of their own summer march. On the 6th of November, the first snow fell. The army that reached the Berezina River 3 weeks later, crossed its burning bridges under fire, and staggered on toward the Niemen, was no longer an army. It was a procession of ghosts. Consider a strange paradox of history. The man who did more than any other to plant the seeds of modern nationalism across Europe was also the man who was destroyed by the harvest. Napoleon Bonaparte did not set out to create nations. He set out to create an empire, a single, enlightened imperium ruled from Paris, organized by French law, conducted in the language of reason, stretching from Cadiz to the gates of Moscow. In his own mind, he was not a conqueror in the old sense. He was a liberator. He was bringing the great gifts of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, brotherhood, to peoples who had groaned for centuries under kings and priests and feudal lords. And there was truth in this. Where his armies went, the Napoleonic code followed. Serfdom was abolished in the German states. The Jewish ghettos of Rome and Venice were opened. The Inquisition was dissolved in Spain. Trial by jury was introduced in Westphalia. Roads were paved. Hospitals were built. In 1,000 quiet ways, a medieval Europe began, under French bayonets, to give way to a modern one. But here is what the emperor never understood. The idea of liberty does not care who first utters it. The idea of a nation belonging to its people, not to a king, not to an emperor, not to a distant capital, but to the men and women who work its soil and speak its language. That idea, once planted, grows in any soil. He taught Europe a new word. That word was nation. He did not mean to teach it. He could not unteach it. In Spain, when the Madrid crowds rose against his brother in May of 1808, they were not fighting for the Bourbon king they had despised only weeks earlier. They were fighting for something newer and stranger, the idea that Spain was theirs, that Spain belonged to Spaniards, that no foreign emperor, however enlightened, had the right to tell them who would sit on the throne. The priest with the musket in the Pyrenean Pass and the woman with the boiling water on the Madrid balcony were citizens in the full revolutionary sense of the word for the first time in their lives. They did not know it, but the emperor had made them so. In Russia, when Kutuzov's peasants burned their own crops ahead of the advancing French, they were acting out the same transformation. The Russian serf of 1812 was still, in law, the property of his lord. He would not be legally freed until 1861. And yet, in the fields outside Smolensk, he had understood something his grandfather could not have understood, that this war was his war, that this soil was his soil, that the foreign army marching through it was not simply another quarrel of princes, but an attack on a thing called Russia, and that Russia was somehow bound up with his own small, cold, ordinary life. The Tsar had named the campaign the Patriotic War. The name stuck. It stuck because it was true, and in Germany, the Germany that did not yet exist, that was still a collection of 300 squabbling principalities, the humiliation of Jena in 1806, and the miseries of French occupation gave birth to something that had never existed before. German philosophers began to speak of a German people. German poets began to write of a German soul. Prussian officers, meeting in quiet rooms in Königsberg, began to plan for a day when they would rise not as Prussians alone, but as Germans, to drive the French back across the Rhine. That day came in 1813, and the wars of the Sixth Coalition were fought on the eastern side by soldiers who believed they were fighting for something larger than any king. Napoleon had thought he was fighting kings. Kings he knew how to defeat. What he was actually fighting, in his final years, was the new thing he had himself created, the nation in arms, the people under a flag, the peasant who suddenly understood that he was a citizen of somewhere. This was the blind spot. This was what he could not see, even to the end. Because in his private correspondence, even from exile, he spoke of his enemies as if they were still merely governments, still merely coalitions of princes. He could not grasp that his true adversary had never worn a crown. His true adversary was the shepherd in Navarre, the monk in Aragon, the serf outside Moscow, the Prussian schoolteacher, the Austrian student, the Dutch merchant who had decided, somewhere between 1807 and 1813, that they would rather die as themselves than live as Frenchmen. The rest of the story is quickly told. After the catastrophe in Russia, the nations that had been held to Napoleon by fear alone began to slip the leash. Prussia turned against him in the winter of 1812, when a Prussian general named York signed a neutrality with the Russians at Toroggen against the orders of his own king. Austria followed soon after. In October of 1813, at Leipzig, a battle fought over 3 days by nearly 600,000 men. The largest battle Europe would see until the First World War, the combined armies of Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden shattered the French host. They called it the Battle of the Nations. The name was not accidental. Paris fell in March of 1814. On the 11th of April, in a room at the Palace of Fontainebleau, Napoleon signed his first abdication. He was sent into exile on Elba, a small Mediterranean island of some 12,000 souls, where the Allies generously allowed him to keep the title of emperor and to rule the rocks and olive groves as a sovereign. He did not stay. In February of 1815, After 10 months of exile, he slipped away from Elba with 1,000 men and landed on the coast of southern France. The army sent to arrest him joined him instead. On the 20th of March, he entered Paris in triumph, to the cheers of the same crowds who, a year earlier, had cheered the return of the Bourbon king. It is called the 100 Days. It lasted almost exactly that long. On the 18th of June, 1815, on a muddy field in Belgium called Waterloo, an Anglo-Dutch army under the Duke of Wellington and a Prussian army under Marshal Blucher broke the last French army Napoleon would ever command. He abdicated 4 days later. He surrendered himself to a British captain on the deck of a warship called the Bellerophon. And on the 15th of October, after a 9-week voyage, he was set ashore on an island in the middle of the South Atlantic, 2,000 miles from anywhere, called St. Helena. He lived there for 6 years, a damp house called Longwood, a jailer named Hudson Lowe, a small, dwindling court of loyal officers who gradually left him one by one. He dictated his memoirs, he studied English. He carved peepholes in his shutters so he could watch the British officers without being watched. He grew fatter, sicker, more bitter. His stomach, which had troubled him for years, began to fail in earnest. On the 5th of May, 1821, at 6 minutes before 6 in the evening, Napoleon Bonaparte died. He was 51 years old. The cause, according to his physician, was a stomach ulcer. Modern scholars believe it was stomach cancer. He was buried on the island in a valley of geraniums under a tombstone that bore no name now. Close your eyes for a moment and think about what he missed. He missed the priest in Carabanchel Alto who murdered the French captain in the spring of 1808. He missed the smuggler in the Dutch harbour, slipping British cotton past a bribed customs officer. He missed the Russian peasant setting fire to his own grain. He missed the Prussian schoolmaster teaching his students in whispers that there was such a thing as a German nation. Each of these was, on its own, nothing, a small flame in a dark room. The emperor, standing at his map table in Paris, could not have seen any one of them if he had tried. But 1,000 small flames gathered become a fire that can burn down an empire. And 1,000,000 small loyalties gathered become the thing we now call a people. This is what the black box of the emperor's fall is whispering to us across 2 centuries. That power is not only what you can see on the map, that genius is not the same thing as wisdom, that the cleverest mind in a palace can lose in the end to the quietest conviction in a cottage, and that the one force more enduring than any army, the love of a people for their own land, their own tongue, their own small idea of who they are, cannot be commanded, cannot be blockaded, cannot be dictated, cannot be decreed. It can only be missed. And if he missed it, this man who spoke 6 languages and read every book he could lay his hands on, this man who rose from an island in the Mediterranean to the throne of the Western world, then what are we missing? Each of us in our smaller lives, with our smaller maps, standing at our own tables, moving our own small markers. What is the quiet thing in our own country, our own workplace, our own family that we have dismissed as beneath notice, that may one day rise and change everything? The story ends here, but history, as always, is just beginning.